Thanks for downloading analysis from the BBC. This week, David Edmonds considers how far insights from the world of psychology could help to resolve seemingly intractable conflicts, and he asks, will they always hate us?
How do you turn this into this?
The agreement that has emerged from the Northern Ireland peace talks opens the way for the people there to build a society based on enduring peace, justice, and equality.
And how do you turn this?
Police have promised a massive presence on the streets of Oldham tonight to try to prevent further violence at the height of last night's
into this.
Whenever I'm stuck at my work, Raddy always helps me and I help Raddy.
Whenever I'm stuck, she's always there. Whenever she's stuck, I'm there.
Conflicts can involve different nations and religions, different races and classes. Some of them seem intractable. The tensions and hatred seem depressingly permanent, whether it's in the Middle East, Northern Ireland, or among clashing groups in some English towns. But there's now a branch of social psychology which offers the hope that group hatreds can be diminished and even overcome if different strategies are adopted. And in this programme we're going to explore how they work and what results the new approaches can offer in tackling age-old conflicts. Since the State of Israel was founded in 1948, it's fought wars with all its neighbours.
I was very, very seriously injured in one of the rounds of violence between Israelis and the Hezbollah in Lebanon.
2 decades ago, Aaron Halperin had an enforced and lengthy stay in hospital while serving in the Israeli army.
My 2 hands since then are just partially functioning, and I lost one of my lungs. And I saw people around me, my family, my close friends who sat near my bed in the hospital for more than 3 months. And I thought to myself, this just cannot be something we cannot change. We must do everything we can in order to find alternative solutions.
Aaron Halperin decided to become a psychologist. He wanted to study the emotions that drive group conflict, and more importantly, how prejudice and hate could be overcome. His experiments have been conducted in both the laboratory and the field, in the Middle East and beyond. In one experiment, a group of Israelis was given a fake newspaper article. It described a Palestinian leader criticising his own society, corruption in Gaza and the West Bank, or shortcomings at schools. A group of Palestinians was likewise exposed to Israelis being self-critical. Each group was then asked about its trust in and empathy for the other side. The results were dramatic.
If Israelis hear a Palestinian leader or just a Palestinian citizen saying something critical about the educational system among the Palestinians or the corruption within the Palestinian government, then suddenly the Israeli is much, much more open to hear what the Palestinian has to say, even about issues related to the conflict. And suddenly what we see is that Israelis who are exposed to such group criticism of the Palestinians are more open to Palestinians' suggestions regarding the possible solutions of the conflict, and we found exactly the same results when we tested it among Palestinians who were exposed to Israelis criticizing their own group.
The effect seems to be achieved by disrupting the idea of monolithic blocks. That's the idea that the other group is overwhelmingly dominated by a single identity, a single value system, a single political objective. It reminds us that, in fact, we have multiple identities. Betsy Levy-Palak is a professor of psychology at Princeton University in the United States.
I have an identity that's different than yours, so I'm an American and you're British. But we also have a shared identity, which is people who are interested in the topic of prejudice. And when people are made aware of those shared identities, prejudice can be reduced. So in other words, if we're having a squabble about American and British relations, one thing that we can do is remind ourselves of that shared identity. In the real world, of course, we know that people who are in conflict actually do share a great deal in common. They share a homeland, they share many traditions. There's intermarriages between groups, and historically they go back a very long way. We know that it's not as simple, though, as just reminding them of those shared identities.
That's too simple, because shifting psychology is only the precursor to shifting policy. Still, even the psychology is tough enough. Showing a capacity for self-criticism requires political courage. So too does owning up to past wrongs and recognising aspects of the other group's identity.
Pity for you, Palestine. After happy days, you have become sad. May God return all refugees and everyone go back to his house.
The Nakba, or the catastrophe. It's the name Palestinians give to their exodus from the land they regard as their home, as the State of Israel was being formed. The Nakba is as central to Palestinians' identity as the Holocaust is to Israeli Jews. For one side to acknowledge the victimhood of the other side can be seen as conferring legitimacy on their enemy's cause. But according to Aaron Halperin, doing so is an effective technique to move hearts and prise open minds. In another experiment, he played a speech to ordinary Israelis. Not a fake one this time, but an actual one. A speech that some people say was the most moving ever given in the Israeli parliament.
This is the moment when we must all divest ourselves of nationalist or religious hats, of otherness, and wear just one garment, the garment of humanity.
We actually used a real speech provided by Knesset member Ahmed Tibi, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, who talked in the Memorial Day for the Holocaust here in Israel and talked about the Holocaust as one of the major disasters in the history of the humankind. And he talked about it as something that is uncomparable to any other disaster of any other society. And what we found is that after Israelis were exposed to this speech, suddenly they were willing to be exposed to things that he or other members of the Palestinian society are saying on other issues related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And even more than that, they were willing to accept what we call difficult truth or criticism over Israeli actions within this context after they heard Ahmed Tibi talking about these kind of things.
Israelis, for example, will more readily acknowledge some of the injustices perpetrated against the Palestinians when Palestinians show a real understanding of core aspects of Israeli identity. Conflicts are usually seen as being about competition for resources or power, and of course, many of them are. Any political settlement eventually requires decisions about where to draw borders, who has control over sources of water, energy and so on. But what the psychological research shows is that it's a mistake to view most conflicts in purely rational and instrumental terms.
We went to leaders. We went to Mr. Netanyahu and we went to Mr. Mashal, the head of the Hamas.
He's given access to top people. Scott Atran calls himself an anthropologist of terror. He's almost as many bases as NATO. He operates from Paris, Michigan and Oxford. When we spoke to him, he was in Singapore. He too stresses the symbolism of acknowledging history.
First we asked Mr. Netanyahu, what is the most important issue for you to discuss with the Hamas? He says, I have nothing to discuss with the Hamas until they recognize the right of the Jewish people to be here. If they're ready to recognize that right, and you can ask him that, then anything is on the table to discuss. So he went to Mr. Mashal, and Mr. Mashal said, we've been in jail for 70 years and our jailer wants us to recognize him. Well, let us out of jail and we'll talk, which wasn't the answer the Israelis were waiting for. But then we asked Mr. Mashal, what would you want from the Israelis? And he said, will they ever apologize for the harm they've done our people in 1948, for their dislocation and dispossession? And then we realized that the things which were moving them most, which led to intractable conflicts, were things like respect, recognition. Apologies were things that could break through where no material trade-off might.
That's the crucial point. Respect before land, gestures before money. When negotiators seek to resolve conflict in Northern Ireland, Israel and elsewhere, it can be tempting to regard the issues that divide the warring parties as open to cost-benefit analysis. In other words, to assume that if both sides can be shown that they have more to gain from a deal than from continuing to fight, they'll be persuaded to settle. The psychological research suggests that approach is wrong-headed. Symbols, apologies, these salute the power of history and identity, and they cost nothing. What do you think the Palestinians can do to convince ordinary Israelis that they're prepared to live in peace with them?
You know, that's the kind of question that always gets my goat. I really get upset when people tell me, how can you assure the Israelis? That comes also from the fact that many Israelis have told me, if anybody had done to us what we had done to you, we will never forgive and forget.
Veteran Palestinian activist and negotiator Hannah Nashrawi. She balks at the idea that Palestinians must convince Israelis of their good intentions. But listen to what she says when asked how Israelis can re-energise the peace process. The first step, she says, is not giving up land or monetary compensation. The first step is symbolic, a recognition.
The first step should be an acknowledgement not just of our narrative, but of Israel's responsibility and culpability. So the moment they begin to accept that this is not a question of a heroic birth of a nation, but a question of a real disaster and historical injustice done to the Palestinian people, then we would start, in a sense, correcting this historical injustice and attempting to rectify the situation.
That's easy for Hannah Nashrawi to demand. But for Israelis, the birth of their nation is a cause of celebration. Expecting them to recognise that it's a legitimate cause of Palestinian anger and despair is asking a lot. Similar psychological barriers are present in almost every conflict.
Sure, there's going to be disagreement, there's going to be dissent. That's in the nature of democracy. But I think when people understand what's at stake, they won't want to go back to what they've had over the past 30 years.
Senator George Mitchell knows a thing or two about diplomacy and negotiation. President Obama appointed him as an envoy for Middle East peace. Before that, he was President Clinton's special envoy to Northern Ireland. George Mitchell recalls the trip Bill Clinton took there.
I arranged meetings for him on his first day with Dr. Ian Paisley and Jerry Adams. They were scheduled for 30 minutes. It was late at night. The president and I were exhausted. In came Dr. Paisley. I introduced him to the president, and then Dr. Paisley launched into a 30-minute statement of the history of Northern Ireland as seen through the eyes of Unionists. And it was essentially a litany of all of the bad things that had been done to the Unionists by the Nationalists, the government of Ireland, and the government of the United Kingdom. There was not a hint of recognition that anything bad had been done to the other side. He finished, we shook hands, he left, in walked Jerry Adams, and he delivered a 30-minute statement on the perspective of Northern Ireland history from that of a nationalist leader, and it was the mirror image of what Dr. Paisley had done. It was a long list of the grievances of nationalists, all of the bad things that had been done to them over the years by the Unionists, by the United Kingdom government. After they left, the president said to me, well, he said, you've got your work cut out for you.
In Northern Ireland, I used to joke that if we ended a meeting in number 10 after only half an hour, we'd have got to 1689, and there were 300 more years of grievances to get through.
Jonathan Powell, the chief British negotiator on Northern Ireland.
They had two completely different histories of the world, and they simply didn't understand the other side's history. People often get trapped in their own narratives. They see themselves as victims, and they cannot understand the victimhood of the other side.
So recognition of the legitimate claims of the other group, and acknowledgement that there might be another reasonable way of telling history, is a fundamental building block to resolving conflict. And then there's fairness.
Time and again, I have made clear to the Iranian people that we will always be open to engagement on the basis of mutual interests and mutual respect. Our differences are real, and the difficult history between our nations cannot be ignored. but it is possible to change.
In July this year, Iran finally signed a deal with major powers around the world to freeze its controversial nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of international sanctions. Sanctions had been in place for years and were crippling the Iranian economy. The puzzle then was why the deal had taken so long to reach. Nick Wright of the University of Birmingham has a background in neuroscience, which he now applies to international conflict. A crucial ingredient in any settlement, he says, is that both sides perceive it to be fair.
The first thing to say about fairness is it's likely to matter across a wide variety of different historical cases. So we can think about Iran, for example, that recent Iranian nuclear deal. Why has Iran been prepared to accept costs of some $100 billion to pursue its nuclear program? If you listen to what the Iranians actually say, it's that, as Foreign Minister Javad Zarif said at the end of 2013, imagine you're told you cannot do something that everyone else can do. What would you do? Would you relent or would you stand your ground?
So people are less rational than we might otherwise have thought, that they take fairness much more seriously than decision makers had realised up until this point.
Exactly.
Here's a thought experiment. Imagine that I've been given a windfall £10 and been told to share it with you. You can only choose to accept or reject my offer. If you accept it, you get to keep what I offer you. But if you reject it, we both get nothing. If I offer you half the money, you'll almost certainly accept £5 to you and £5 to me. But what if I offer you only £1? £1 still better than nothing, right?
If you only cared about what you were going to receive, then the decision for you would be £1 for you or £0. Okay, so obviously you should choose to accept the offer, accept the 9-1 split, because you're getting £1 rather than nothing. But what most people do is they say, oh God, that's terribly unfair. You're getting £9 and I'm only getting £1. That's very unfair and I'm going to reject it.
People are prepared to forego money in the name of fairness. And it turns out that offers of less than 25% in this type of experiment are routinely rejected. That's true whether you conduct the experiment in London or Lagos, India or Indonesia. But if an unfair offer will be rejected even when both parties stand to gain from it, there are occasions when any offer at all, any monetary offer, will backfire, will make things worse. We've seen that deals have to be perceived to be fair, but they must also deftly handle what are called sacred values. Protests earlier this year around the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque in the old city of Jerusalem. The complex is sacred to both Islam and Judaism. It's one of several sticking points between the two sides. Suppose that Israel, recognising the site's significance for most Palestinians, offered to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in exchange for its continued control of the complex. That might sound like a sensible way out of the impasse.
Sacred values differ from material values precisely because all the traditional assumptions of rational actors, of utility, of trade-offs fly out the window.
Scott Atran researches sacred values. These aren't necessarily religious values. They're values which are core to identity, the values which drive and define us.
When things are sacred, if you try to trade them off, not only doesn't it work, but it backfires. So, for example, suppose I offered you money for your child. Well, you might think I'm crazy. If I continued and insisted, you might get angry. Well, it's the same for people who offer to trade money for being a traitor to your country, or to your religion, or to the right of return, or to whatever sacred value you may hold. And we do experiments, of course, and the more material incentives or disincentives, sanctions, are offered, the greater the insult and the more violent people get in the defense of those values. And we did this with the Iranians, for example, when the nuclear issue started to get bound up with notions of national identity and even religious identity as people began demonstrating in the streets with the Quran. For those rural religious folks who supported the then President Ahmadinejad, the more we tried either sanctions or material offers, the deeper they became entrenched, the more they ratcheted up the production of highly enriched uranium, the more centrifuges they produced, because it had become bound up with religious and national identity. It had become part of a transcendental issue.
Symbols can often be more important than substance.
Jonathan Powell.
When we were negotiating with the Ulster Unionists, for them, the issue of whether the royal crown should be on the cap badge of the new police force was vastly more significant than what happened to IRA weapons. They argued about it far longer and were prepared to make much greater concessions in order to get that.
Fairness, the sacred, recognising failings within one's own group, as well as the narrative of one's enemies, these are all psychologically useful levers to pull in the pursuit of peace. But they're much more difficult to pull when the warring sides are apart, when they're glaring at each other across a physical barrier. In parts of Northern Ireland, the two main communities, Protestant and Catholic, have virtually no contact with each other. What contact they do have is often hostile, for example during the summer marching season. But whether the walls are in West Belfast or the West Bank, lack of interaction can make one side blind to the humanity of the other. Even meeting and shaking hands with enemy representatives can take on an epic symbolism.
When the Ulster Unionist Party first joined the talks alongside Sinn Féin, they would never address Sinn Féin. They would only talk to George Mitchell in the chair and not directly to them. In fact, it got to the ludicrous state where Gerry Adams would try and ambush them in the gents. He would go into the gents after a Unionist MP and go up to the urinal and try and address them at the urinal, and they'd refuse to talk back to him. In fact, one young Unionist accounts going into the gents and finding Adams there and rushing into the cubicle and shutting the door and having Adams shouting at him, "Your problem is you have the siege mentality."
Weeks of simmering racial tension in Oldham finally erupted last night as more than 500 Asian youths fought pitched battles with riot police, armed with bricks and petrol bombs and aiming fireworks at police.
That siege mentality was present here in Oldham. The unrest in 2001 took the country by surprise. They were the worst race riots for 15 years. In retrospect, the signs of trouble were obvious. Asians and whites lived then, and still live now, separate lives. I'm walking through the poor neighbourhood of Glodick, where the back-to-back terraced homes were built for mill workers. They're now almost exclusively occupied by Asian families. But it's not just housing. Whites and Asians don't live together, they don't play together, they don't pray together, and they don't go to school together. After the 2001 unrest in Oldham and other towns in the north of England, various inquiries were set up, the biggest on community cohesion, resulting in the Cantle Report. One phrase from that inquiry has been regularly repeated. British Asians and whites, the report stated, led parallel lives, and the segregation had to be addressed. Oldham witnessed an intriguing initiative involving the merger of two culturally different schools. A team of academics has been studying what's happened.
This really exciting step was taken where you took two pre-existing schools, Breeze Hill and Count Hill, one of which was almost entirely white British, the other was almost entirely Asian British, and you said, we'll take this pint of milk, we'll take this pint of Guinness, and we'll pour them into a new quart pot. And that's essentially what they did.
Research into the new school, Waterhead Academy, has been led by Oxford's Professor of Social Psychology, Miles Houston. He's Britain's leading advocate of what's called contact theory.
Contact theory is the idea that you can reduce prejudice between members of different groups by bringing them together under positive conditions.
David Cameron appears to endorse contact theory. In a major set-piece speech on extremism in July, the Prime Minister mentioned Oldham in particular.
It cannot be right, for example, that people can grow up and go to school and hardly ever come into meaningful contact with people from other backgrounds and faiths. Similarly in education, while overall segregation in schools is declining, in our most divided communities, the education that our young people receive is actually even more segregated than the neighbourhoods they live in.
There are places where conflict has arisen despite day-to-day contact. Remember Bosnia. All the same, the idea that contact generally improves relations between groups sounds like it's a claim of the blindingly obvious. Yet segregation in parts of Britain has been allowed to become entrenched. In the study of Waterhead Academy, the Oxford team have collected a vast amount of data. They agreed to reveal it to this programme.
This is the wave 1 that we have?
An extraordinarily intricate diagram with little maroon circles and little yellow circles. What do they represent?
Each of these are students. So on here, the sort of purpley maroony colour is an Asian student, and the yellow nodes on here are the white students. So it allows for sort of very impactful visual idea of the kind of clustering that goes on in terms of the friendships.
Twice a term, one of the research team, Christina Flo, has been visiting Waterhead. Depending on your perspective, the results could be seen as depressing or encouraging. They're depressing because they show, for example, that at the end of the first year, among whites, only 7.5% of their friends were Asian, what researchers call the outgroup. On the other hand, at the beginning of the year, the figure was only 2.5%. So is Christina Flo encouraged or depressed by these results?
I'm pretty optimistic. If Waterhead didn't exist, we know that these students were otherwise, and their peers are going to schools that are largely homogenous. You know, they don't have these opportunities to form any outgroup friends. In a way, it's encouraging that even looking at time 1, you know, they've been in the school for 2 terms, they've made outgroup friends. It's not many, but it's a start.
And some firm friendships across races are being made.
She's fun and she doesn't take things seriously.
What do you like about Olivia?
She has a crazy mind.
Olivia and Radia are both 12 years old and personify the contact theory. Radia lives in Glodick, an Asian part of town. Had the school merger not taken place, it's unlikely she and Olivia would ever have met. Their friendship has limits. Although inseparable at school, they've still not visited each other's homes. But their cultural differences seem to them insignificant.
They work so hard, they pray 5 times a day, and they fast in Ramadan for Allah. I find it a bit strange because I don't pray 5 times a day.
And do you find it strange that Olivia doesn't pray at all?
I do know that, obviously, that she doesn't pray, but I know that she still believes in God.
Do you think you'll be friends for your entire life?
Yeah, mostly, because we're really good friends now.
What about you?
Maybe not forever, because sometimes she's annoying, but sometimes I like it, because, I don't want boring friends.
The research shows that each year the children are at school, they have a more positive attitude towards the other group and less nervousness and anxiety. Contact does seem to work. Contact theory and social psychology offer no panacea for settling the world's intractable conflicts. What they do offer is greater insight into what motivates enmity, and a different approach to bringing parties in conflict together. They also raise the question, do we have the courage to embrace this approach and the possibilities it presents?
Analysis was presented by David Edmonds. The producer was Simon Coates. And you might be devastated to learn that was the last programme in the current series. But fear not, Analysis returns in January and you can download previous programmes from the Radio 4 website. And David Edmonds, who presented this week, has produced a brilliant and very funny series of The Philosopher's Arms, which will be on air from next month. Do subscribe to the Download now.